David Blue.
Well, let's see, make sure everybody can hear. We've got quite a large room today. Those folks in the back, can you hear me okay? Just fine? Good. Well, let's see. I'll say a few things about myself, and I'm going to depart from my usual way of getting into things because this is a peak oil group, and I noticed a lot of people are not part of the every week thing. Might need a little background on what peak oil is. So I'll keep that brief because some of you already do know quite a bit about that. I first learned about alcohol when I was in college about 1 million years ago. And I had a particularly good ecology teacher who would lie to the students with a straight face just to see if he could get away with it. And we were looking at this bottle of fermenting beer on the table, and he said, "That stuff would run your car." And I took one look at him and I said, "You're a liar." He said, "Prove it." Well, I went off to the library, and I came back with a stack of books like this, all about the use of alcohol in vehicles, going way, way back, and I'll tell you about some of that history. So anyway, it blew my mind that I'd never heard of this before. This was just unbelievable that we could be educated in this country and not know what fueled the second most expensive thing we own after a house. And that set me on a whole trajectory where I ended up teaching workshops some years later when we had the Arab oil embargoes. And I see enough people with gray hair here so you'll remember that. For those of you who weren't there, because you were still pretty young, we actually had to stand in line to get gasoline, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, because it was rationed, and we had to wait our turn. And we haven't had to do that since 1979 or 1980, but we might start seeing some of that happen again. And so a little bit of what I'll be talking about is what we can do to avoid that happening. I also have an extensive background in farming, and I operated a community-supported agriculture teaching farm in the San Francisco Bay Area on 2 acres, one of which was on a 45-degree slope. And we fed 450 people from those 2 acres. We did that with a system called permaculture, which I'll be referring to several times tonight, but I'm not going to go too far into what permaculture is because it's a whole 2-week course in itself. So, but you'll see, when you see what we're talking about tonight in terms of integrating different parts of farming and energy together, this is the way we think of things in permaculture, and I'll try to point some of those out as we go along. Well, people have pretty much stopped showing up, so let's do a little list making here. I never come with a talk that is pre-canned, so what I want to know, because I can talk about alcohol for 8 hours straight and then tell you to come back tomorrow for another 8 hours, and we don't have that long. So what I'd like to do is find out what you want to know about alcohol fuel, what things you've heard that you want cleared up, and we'll just start off with a list of questions from you. And don't worry, these won't be the only questions you can ask. You can ask them any time during the talk. Because if you have a question, so do 6 other people have the same question. So I'm totally there for you to go back and forth with me on questions. But let's get an initial list so I know where to start, which you can ask. Okay. All right. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about peak oil first before we really get into alcohol fuel. When we talk about oil is a thing that happened once in the history of the planet. We had huge inland seas that were full of algae that died and went to the bottom and was huge layers of this stuff. And over time it got buried under soil and got deeper and deeper until the pressure converted that algae into oil. Not dinosaurs, none of that, algae. Okay, so that happened at one point in history. And in fact, if you keep putting too much pressure on this stuff that turns into oil, where you've got like 15,000 feet of soil above, like with changes in geology, it won't even stay as oil anymore. It'll all turn to natural gas. So basically, if you put under enough pressure, oil will continue to break down and will become natural gas. Smaller amounts of natural gas are always found in oil anyway, even at different depths. Because when oil comes up out of the ground, it practically fizzes in many cases with all the gas that's in it. So peak oil, this stuff was made once in history. It's never going to be made again. And at some point, we're going to run out. That is not today. We are not going to run out of oil today. It's not going to happen one day where suddenly we don't have oil. And in fact, I would argue that we will never run out of oil. We may run out of money to pay for oil. It may get pretty scarce and, we may not have access to it like we do now. But just like anything, just like mushrooms in the forest, you keep picking them and you keep picking them. The ones you got to go farther to get, you sell for more because it's more work, and at some point it's not worth going any further in the forest to get the mushrooms. And that will eventually happen with oil. But long before that time, there's a key moment at which the demand for oil keeps going up and the ability to produce more oil stops and starts to go down no matter what you think you can do about it. Because, quite frankly, we've been very good at finding oil for the last 100 years, and we've done a really good job at tapping into most of it. So we have basically at this point reached the halfway point. And we're on the plateau now. We're starting to go down the other side. Now, you'll hear a lot of debate about this. Is it 5 years from now? Is it 10 years from now? Is it 50 years from now? Or has it already happened? I'm going to give you a little different definition of peak oil because I think it's more valid. I'm going to give you the functional definition of peak oil. Are we going to have more oil the following year than the year before? And I'm going to argue that we've already hit that point. Not because it isn't possible to squeeze a little more oil out of the ground, but there are many things that limit how much oil we're going to get out from here on out. And I'll give you as evidence of that a little-known incident that happened in November 2003. OPEC had a meeting, and they said, let's just see what happens if we cut back production 3%. Now, OPEC's about a third of the world's oil, so that's like a 1% drop in production. And they did that. They stood back and waited to see who was going to pick up the money on the table, who was going to increase their production, and take that part of the market that they were leaving out. No one could. They said, well, that's odd. Maybe some refineries are down for repairs, or maybe there's a labor strike, or who knows what, but maybe it's just a fluke. So in February 2004, they dropped the production of oil by 10%. And they were sure this was going to get some action, because that's 3% of the world's supply. And they left that money on the table, and no one could pick it up. No oil could be produced to replace that was no longer available. So I would argue with anyone at this point that that's proof positive that we're already at peak oil, that we cannot, even when the money is on the table, get more oil so that we can sell it. And what happens when we hit peak oil is there's a lot of debate about that. We're going to cover some of that. But it's not an overnight situation. It doesn't suddenly change overnight because, we've drifted into this, as I've just argued, over the last 3 years. And yet, the first real sign that we're having in the United States that there's a problem is with the prices. Okay? And we'll drop in on some of the reasons why that's happening. But it basically is the beginning salvo of the whole what happens when oil starts to plateau and then drop off. Now, Exxon, of course, is not likely to give you a pessimistic evaluation of oil, but they did a study in 2005 where they looked at the future of oil. That was 2010 out here, 2005 right here, 2000 and out here. I'm just going to do a little off scale, 2050. So the way their chart looks of oil production, it looks like it comes up, starts to flatten out about 2005, and at 2010 it starts to go down. Okay, so this is Exxon's definition of peak oil. They figure we got about 5 years. Now, the demand for oil is expected to do this. And what Exxon says is all of this will be having to come from OPEC. And that isn't possible.